Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, we've got a pretty full agenda today, I gather.
Yes, hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. You've been on your travels again, and while you've been away in Italy, there's been an amazing amount of stuff coming out in relation to transport policy in the UK. So we're going to try in fairly short order to bring our listeners up to date with as many aspects of this as we can. First of all, we'll be looking at the position with HS2, the UK's new high-speed rail system, which originally was going to link London with Birmingham and other northern cities, on which there was a major announcement from the UK government just a few days ago. The UK government also made an announcement on its policy regarding driverless cars or autonomous vehicles, a subject which loyal listeners will know is dear to your heart and something that you'll have some views to express upon. While you've been away, we've also had some big financial announcements from the UK government on public spending across the economy, but obviously we'll be looking at particular reference to transport and transport related infrastructure. But they've also published a 10-year infrastructure strategy which covers the transport sectors as well. And so we will be trying to unpick some of those announcements and understand their significance. And finally, you'll be touching on the Mayor of London's announcement regarding the future management of traffic and pedestrians in London's famous Oxford Street.
Right. Well, Mark, yes, let's get going with HS2. Now, you've been looking at the report. I've read some of that report. It's pretty shocking stuff, isn't it?
Yes, we had the Secretary of State for Transport, Heidi Alexander MP, come to the House of Commons on the 18th of June to update MPs on the High Speed 2 rail project. And the Secretary of State simultaneously published two very significant documents. Now, one of these was a review by somebody called James Stewart, who'd been commissioned by her predecessor, Louise Haigh, to look into the governance of the HS2 project and why things seemed to be going awry. And this was towards the end of 2024. So that a report was published at the same time as the Secretary of State came to the chamber. And she also published an interim report from Mark Wilde, who's the new chief executive of HS2 Limited, describing his efforts so far to reset the project and effectively get the whole thing back on, if not on time, at least to some clear outcomes.
On track, as it were, although
As
we
it
don't
were,
use
as
this
it
sort
were.
of.
Thank you. That was the word I think I was looking for, Christian. So so these two things were published, and the Secretary of State said that James Stewart's report had identified five key recommendations. So very briefly, it was that there had been a lack of effective ministerial oversight of the project, which had caused it, contributed towards it getting into so much difficulty with being delayed and over budget. And amazingly, there had not been an effective task force of ministers during the latter days of the previous government exercising any real supervision over the HS2 project, even though it was huge and significant and very expensive. There was also a recommendation for stricter cost control. The third recommendation was to address a lack of capability in HS2 Limited in particular. And the Secretary of State said, well, look, we've appointed Mark Wilde as the chief executive now, who's getting a grip of all of this and instilling a new era of leadership and reforming the organisation. The fourth issue was around Euston Station, something we've discussed previously on this podcast, and the fact that at the moment it's really a huge flattened site
It's
where
a
the
bomb
proposed
site. It
HS2.
looks like post-World War II bombs have hit it.
Indeed. And that links in with the question of the tunnelling from Old Oak Common in West London to reach Euston Station, which the government said it's allowing to go ahead. And then lessons drawn from the wider transport portfolio. So essentially, how do we stop this happening again with other big transport projects? How do we avoid this experience of delay, cost overruns, all sorts of difficulties with contractors, and not really the public seeing anything for their money for a very long time? So these were the five key points. There was then, as you would expect, quite a lot of political hyperbole directed against the previous government, who, for the most part, of course, were in office while these difficulties were run into with the HS2 project. Interestingly, when the Conservative spokesperson, Gareth Bacon, replied, there was quite a lot of kind of mea culpa from him. We do accept that we made some pretty bad mistakes in office with the HS2
Yeah, I thought that was
project.
very good, actually. That was a rare event of not making cheap political points, but kind of accept. I thought that was impressive.
Yeah, I thought so as well. Rather than just sort of yarboo and try
Yeah.
and turn it back onto the present administration. In the letter from Mark Wilde, that was published at the same time. As you'll recall, he's the chief executive of HS2 Limited now and tasked with getting a grip of all of this. Um, he His assessment was that the overall project, in terms of cost, schedule, and scope, is unsustainable. Due to the scale of the mismanagement of the project, his letter sets out that there is no route by which trains can be running by 2033 as previously planned, and warned that costs would continue to increase if matters were not taken in hand, which clearly he's doing. So that's the sort of progress report
But
from him.
there's an interesting question there, Mark. That they've said that they're delaying it. Now, as I understand it, it will be till at least 2036, although they didn't quite put it like that. But that has been partly presented as a way of, well, one of the problems with the scheme has been that they're running to a deadline, and because they're running to this deadline, it's kind of increased costs. So they're presenting this as a way possibly of it costing less. But in my experience, the longer a project goes on, the more it costs. And certainly that was the case with the project that Mark Wilde was previously associated with, which was Crossrail, now the Elizabeth line, which was extended for 3 and a bit years when he, to be fair to him, he intervened when things had gone wrong and he did sort it out. But because it took another 3 and a bit years, it cost another £3 billion. So are they saying that they're going to save money by extending the opening time, or are they just kind of bowing to the inevitable?
Well, one of the curious features of all of this, and loyal listeners might remember it came up in the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee at the end of last year, was that they actually don't know how much it's going to cost, and it seems they still don't know how much it's going to cost. So the government has set aside a significant amount of money to enable HS2 to be completed, or at least to go through its next phases. And this was
Yeah,
in the
£7 billion a year over each of the next 4 years, according to the spending review. So
Yes,
seven
extraordinary
point
amounts of
one
money.
billion pounds
Yeah,
every. That's £20 million a day.
it's
It's
extraordinary amounts of money. I mean, you and I have been fortunate enough to see how some of this money is spent and the amazing structures and features in the landscape that are being delivered with it. But nevertheless, the overall sort of budgetary envelope is still uncertain, and presumably Mark Wilde and his other, hopefully now able and clever advisors are going to be working out how to deliver this by a particular time and for a particular sum of money. But it was interesting, Christian, that although the Labour government remains very committed to completing HS2 from Old Oak Common in West London to Birmingham, and also eventually from Euston to Old Oak Common, one new sort of issue that was injected into the political discourse was the response from Nigel Farage of Reform to the Secretary of State's statement, because he said just cancel the lot. Actually,
Yes, this was then picked up by Simon Jenkins in The Guardian, who wrote a piece saying it should be scrapped, but it must be pointed out that I read the piece and there was no kind of explanation of how much money would be saved, because these contracts would have to be continued to some extent, and also I don't think there was any proper consideration of the fact that this would be the most embarrassing thing to UK PLC ever. That nobody would ever want to come and work in a project in this country ever again, because they'll say, "Well, look what happened to HS2." And also, Mark, we would end up with these structures, which you and I saw. The 10-mile tunnel underneath the Chilterns, the 2-mile viaduct over Colne Valley, the huge viaducts as it comes into Birmingham, which actually have been completed since we were there. I mean, I look, I've always been an opponent of this scheme, but I think once you've spent 30-40 billion pounds on it, I just think to end up with nothing at all is just too humiliating. I don't know what you think about that.
That's my position, and I've probably been generally more enthusiastic about the whole thing than you have been during its lifetime. I've always kind of understood and supported the overarching purpose of it, you might say, and I do agree that to leave those structures as curious, relics in the landscape for hundreds, if not thousands of years would be a very, very strange thing for this country to do as a way of advertising that we're open for business. But I think it's also worth recalling, Christian, in this period of openness when it comes to these reports and recommendations, that one of these reports might not have ever seen the light of day had it not been for you.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I wrote about the James Stewart report, and indeed, to some extent, the Mark Wilde response in Rail magazine a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, and basically then that got picked up in the press, in several newspapers, the Telegraph and the Guardian, for example, that that the government was not publishing these reports, and I think it was a result of the leak that they decided to do so. So at least we're a bit further on, but it must be said that nothing that Heidi Alexander said actually pointed the way to any decisions. So they still haven't really decided about the tunneling through to Euston, even though they've got permission to do that. They haven't got the money to do it, nor do we know the fate of the line north of Birmingham, or at least north of Handsacre Junction, which is where it rejoins the West Coast Main Line, and no decision has been made about that. And these are pressing matters because every day you don't make a decision, there are more costs involved. So we really, as well as £7.1 billion a year, we need some decisions to be made.
An issue dear to your heart, Christian, is the prospect of driverless cars on Britain's roads. And just a few days ago, we had an announcement from the UK government on this. Would you like to bring listeners up to date?
Yes, I mean, when you say I'm an enthusiast about the issue of driverless cars. That's true, but I'm not an enthusiast for them. These blasted cars themselves, which I've been very sceptical about right from the beginning. Indeed, I wrote a little book called "Driverless Cars on the Road to Nowhere." Well, they seem to be on a road or going to be on our roads next year. Now, we've had these sort of promises many, many times before, but I certainly think that the Department of Transport has drunk the Kool-Aid on this one, because it's issued this extraordinary kind of statement about how it's hoping there'll be fully driverless cars next year. That remarkably, that over the next decade, this is apparently going to create 38,000 jobs, and add £42 billion to the UK economy. Now, how they managed to get these numbers and how they think this technology is ready is just absolutely unfathomable. So let's deal with the technology first. Look, we have driverless cars or robo taxis in some parts of America, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, a couple of other places. They do have cars you can hail, which operate in certain areas of those towns and cities. They're certainly not able to go everywhere. And certainly the Waymo cars, which are most of them Google, they don't go on highways. In other words, they don't go on motorways. And how we think we're going to get from there to having driverless cars on presumably London's roads by next year, operated, as I understand it, by Uber, uh, under legislation that is quite restrictive. There's very good legislation passed by the last government, which ensures that every aspect of driverless cars, every driver aid, every way in which these cars use technology has to be agreed by the government or the Department for Transport. And I just don't see how, given this current state of the technology, we are going to get to a position where there can be genuinely driverless cars on London and Britain's roads by next year. And all of this seems to be a mad fantasy that, this is the second part of it, that this will create jobs. Well, if this were going to be successful, which I don't think it will be, but if it was going to be successful, there'd be thousands or tens of thousands of people thrown out of their jobs, because we'd have driverless taxis, driverless trucks, driverless buses, God knows what else. And so there is no explanation in this document at all about how this fits in with what the government calls the policy for change, which is the kind of mission-led statement of Keir Starmer kind of early on in the government's. And you just wonder what on earth they are thinking of in terms of pushing this technology, which nobody really wants, which is going to be very difficult to operate in towns and cities in the UK, which are not built on a grid system, where the cars will have to be taught to drive on the left instead of the right. So with that's going to be kind of a start. And they're suggesting that this will be without safety drivers. Well, look, Mark, I'll put my money on this, right? I'll bet you a fiver, or even 50 quid, or even 500 quid, that over the next year, by 2026, there won't be any driverless cars on our roads, right? And you can hold me to account next year. But I just think that this is a complete fantasy. The whole aspect of the jobs and the extra money for government is a whole fantasy. And really, I'm shocked that Heidi Alexander and Lillian Greenwood, who's the roads minister, have not done their research properly to look at the problems over this, and just kind of, as I said, drank the Kool-Aid and said, right, this is going to be fine, and we're going to do this.
Yeah, it's one of these things where there's this sort of collective sort of, I don't know, kind of some kind of technological hive mind that says this is what's going to happen. And it doesn't matter that we have a change of government and new ministers come in. And as you say, they just kind of get absorbed into the hive mind and start then making these ludicrous statements about the 38,000 jobs. I mean, I can't imagine that the people, as you say, that drive my taxis or buses here in Peterborough are going to be thrilled to bits about being replaced by autonomous vehicles, and don't imagine themselves being redeployed as some kind of AI programmers or whatever in the back office running these systems. I mean, it just seems utterly inconceivable, doesn't it, that there's
No,
this
I mean they've been
employment
hooked on
link.
all the. I've been writing about this for a decade now almost, and so I have a little collection of kind of statements that were made by Elon Musk, of course, is one of the
Of
people
course, he's bound to
promoting
be
this.
in the mix. Yeah.
Yes, but we'll keep him out of this. But this statement had things like self-driving vehicles can also improve transport for millions of people, providing greater choice and flexibility to get around more easily. Now, just think about that. What do they mean by that? Because people can get around by being driven in a taxi pretty much anywhere they want. So the only difference is that there won't be a driver in the taxi. But why will that make it any easier or better for them? And or they can drive their own car, or they can take buses. But in what way does self-driving cars improve transport for millions of people? I mean, this is just techno babble, and it's you're right about, yes, they seem to become swept up in this kind of almost cult of technology, saying that, well, this has got to come. And honestly, what I wrote about in these books, in my book 7 or 8 years ago, still all stands. There's all these basic questions to be asked about this, and these ministers, and it's interesting that one of the ministers is Peter Kyle, is the technology minister, not a transport minister, is most enthusiastic about this, saying we can't afford to take a back seat on AI unless it's on a self-driving bus. Ha ha ha. Well, there was a self-driving bus that sort of had an operator as well, driving across the Forth Bridge. And it was so unpopular with people that they've scrapped the trial scheme, as we
I didn't
mentioned in
know
a
that.
previous.
That's
Yes,
really, is that the case? That is
yeah, we
amazing.
mentioned it, and
Yeah.
they scrapped it because people didn't really want to go on this bus at all, and so they abandoned the project. And the history, the recent history, is littered with projects that have never come about. I mean, Britain was supposed to launch a autonomous lorry kind of a thing where there'd be kind of convoys of lorries, so there'd be a driver in the first lorry and nobody
Oh, the
in the next three or
platoons. They were
four.
going to be platoons of
Yeah,
lorries,
platoons
weren't
of
they?
lorries.
That's right. Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
found that this was very difficult because if the lorries were different, made by different companies and had different acceleration correct characteristics, it was very difficult for them to keep up with each other. And they never did this experiment.
Right.
So anyway, we'll leave it. That I repeat again, there won't be any driverless cars on our road in 2026, whatever Peter Cowell and Heidi Alexander think.
And no doubt we'll be returning to this subject
We
in
will many
future
times.
episodes of the podcast.
As I've been on my travels, Mark, you've been holding the fort in the UK, and you've been looking at the sheaf of documents that's come out about public spending and about infrastructure plans. And have you found anything surprising in any of this?
Well, thank you for the invitation, Christian, to try to summarize what's been happening in this field of public investment into the UK's transport systems. So, first of all, amid much fanfare, we had, of course, on the 11th of June, the Chancellor of the Exchequer's spending review, which set out her plans for public expenditure across the entirety of the economy over the next several years. And within that, you then have to try to draw out what is the expenditure plans and characteristics related to transport. Now, a few days before the actual statement in the House of Commons, the Chancellor had been in Manchester announcing some big investments for city region transport, which drew a great deal of publicity. in those locations and across the country, because she announced a total of £15.6 billion of capital expenditure to elected mayors in some of the largest city regions, supporting a variety of schemes involving zero emission buses, trams, and local rail investments.
And a new line from Liverpool to Manchester, apparently.
Well, there are passing references to that new line between Liverpool and Manchester, but not actually any commitment of money so far. So there are warm words, and this is what you sometimes have to do, is distinguish between the warm words and the specifics of money being allocated. Because there was another £2.3 billion of what's called local transport grant, which goes to local authorities which are not covered by metropolitan city regions and metro mayors. There was also some money for London, which was described as the largest multi-year settlement to London for transport in over a decade.
But Sadiq was not happy.
Indeed. So again, when you try to look into the detail, you find that there is not the money for the big schemes that London really wants to see developed, and which they believe, the mayor in particular believes, can drive economic growth in the capital. They set aside £24 billion of capital funding to maintain and improve motorways and local roads across the country. But that's a huge sum, and quite how it's going to be divided up and used between those various players is far from clear yet. There was an agreement to continue the £3 bus fare cap, which was originally due to end at the end of the current year, and in fact had more or less been written off, I think, by the Transport Department. They'd more or less given up that they were going to be able to continue with the £3 bus fare cap, but that's continuing now until March 2027. And then there was money committed to finish some of the big heavy rail schemes, the Transpennine route upgrade in the north of England, and the east-west rail link between the South Midlands and the east of England. So those were given continuing funding. There was quite good news for Wales in that there was £300 million of investment, which in some estimates actually comes up to a total of £445 million by some arithmetical sleight of hand to deliver on some of the recommendations of the Burns Commission to improve public transport in southeast Wales.
That was the commission that looked into alternatives to the M4 when they scrapped the M4.
Absolutely,
that was a very positive kind of
they
document.
took that very brave decision back in 2019. And there was some money for dealing with a particular congestion hotspot on the rail network between Wrexham and Liverpool to enable increased frequency of passenger services there. And of course, as we've already discussed in this podcast, there was 25.3 billion.
Billion.
let's get the right number of zeros to deal with HS2 between Birmingham and Euston. So this was
I looked at that. It takes up a third of the whole transport budget, capital and operating costs. It takes up a whole third of it.
Yeah,
It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. So these are some of the sort of capital items, and you have to sort of try and make a distinction between money that goes into capital to kind of expand and improve services and networks, and the financial support for ongoing services, the revenue support that goes into the transport sector. And what happens there in the spending review is that money for the Department for Transport actually goes down over the spending review period, and it drops by 3.6% overall. And the answer the government gives to that, and I think it may be seen as a fair answer, is that they can do that partly because they anticipate increased revenue coming into the rail business in particular, as the railways continue to recover from COVID. And also there's the unwinding of the sort of longer term effects of the extended period of industrial disputes from which the rail industry is now passing. So they're pretty confident on revenue growth on rail to make up for some of the losses, at least on public expenditure, revenue support. And this is in the context, of course, of the government having a tight budget within which to operate. Some might argue for reasons that they've imposed on themselves, but nevertheless, they've obviously have expectations to meet from the public on notably health, schools, policing, and increasingly on defence.
But Mark, what I take from this and the way you present it is that there's no overriding strategy here. There's no kind of idea, well, we must get more people on their bicycles, or we must kind of have more sustainable transport, or, we must kind of ensure that, our railways continue to expand. It's just a kind of hodgepodge of ideas. And that lack of coherence is well demonstrated by the fact that they're even supporting the third runway at Heathrow and the Lower Thames Crossing, which is the biggest road scheme in the country at kind of £9 billion, without any kind of context to this. Is that fair?
I think, to use a transport analogy, there is a certain amount of cart before horse here, because we are still waiting to see the integrated national transport strategy for England, which was commissioned as just about her very last act by Louise Haigh as the outgoing Secretary of State for Transport last November. That's due for publication, I believe, before the parliamentary summer recess. But yes, you're right in a sense. You think you'd have the strategy first, and then the sort of big implementation plan, and then the money to support the implementation plan. And in a way, as a further example, if the cart is before the horse, well, maybe this is the sort of connecting bar between the cart and the horse operating it in the wrong order. Was we've also had in the last few days the 10-year infrastructure strategy from the UK government that was published by Darren Jones, who is the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who is very, very senior minister, generally regarded as kind of number two to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he published an infrastructure, as I say, this 10-year infrastructure strategy in the House of Commons. And what we find here is there are some sort of absolutely mind-boggling numbers presented. So this isn't just for transport, this is for the totality of the economy. But the government is pledging 725 billion, yes, I did say 725 billion of funding for the entirety of the economy over the next decade for infrastructure. So they present this as kind of one of their big ideological policy shift changes from the previous administration.
But do we have any numbers to compare that with in the past? I mean, includes power stations and reservoirs and God knows what else.
Includes the totality of the economy, and it does it over a 10-year cycle, which is very unusual because an awful lot of planning in this country gets done on a 1-year basis, sometimes on a 3 or 5-year basis. But this is a 10-year plan. And what they also claim to be doing is they claim to be joining up the thinking about infrastructure development in different sectors of the economy. So this is quite radical stuff for the UK. But essentially the idea that, well, if you're going to build some houses somewhere, you really ought to think about what the rail service and the tram service and the road network are going to be like. and
Yes,
the
yes, yes.
the digital infrastructure and the water and the energy
Yeah.
supplies, and perhaps you might sort of take a view about the entirety of this. And so and you would do this on a sort of national, a regional, and a local basis. They also say that when it comes to the supply chain, the companies that will deliver all these new forms of infrastructure, they're going to provide them as early as next month, July, with a pipeline showing what all the opportunities are they expect to be emerging for businesses to compete to actually deliver. Now, people in the rail sector will roll their eyes a bit at this because we've had a rail network enhancements pipeline just for the rail sector, theoretically, for
Which
the
has never
last
been published.
well, I think was published kind of once
Right, yes.
in 2019,
Yeah,
I think, and then never updated, and so it's a huge task, to manage this kind of gigantic spreadsheet just for one sector, let alone for the entirety of the economy. But that's what they claim they're going to be doing. They also say, linking the spending review with the infrastructure statement, that they're doing some reforms. It's a bit nerdy, this, but to something called the Green Book, which is the basis on which they decide whether a particular project represents value for money. And there's long been a complaint that, in particular in relation to transport, that schemes in London and the southeast always get rated as good
yeah,
value for money because there are lots of people there already and lots of people already using the transport system. So for every pound you
yeah.
spend, you're probably going to get several pounds back in economic benefits. Whereas for other parts of the UK, that doesn't always work. Now, the government's saying that it's going to address that point.
Well, this is the dreaded cost benefit analysis and
Exactly.
business cases and all this rubbish about time savings kind of being of value to the economy, which I remember that the Tories at one point said, "Oh, if we increase the speed limit to 80 miles an hour, we're going to boost the economy by X billion pounds." I mean, it's all that kind of nonsense, and I hope that the reform is a very radical one and has a completely new methodology for assessing transport projects. Because my God, we need it.
But also, of course, you have to have a methodology which isn't just one that then can be manipulated to provide any answer that you
Yeah,
want based on the political desirability of a project in an area, that might have some electoral advantage as well. So these are difficult factors to balance. Let me just take a few other points from this 10-year infrastructure strategy, particularly relating to transport. So there is a big stress on wanting to involve the private sector in the provision of transport infrastructure. They say they're going to do this through partly through a deal that the government has done with the pensions industry, something called the Mansion House Accord, which is designed up. Listeners will know that sometimes we hear about British transport infrastructure being financed by things like Canadian teachers' pension funds, and you think,
absolutely. Yeah.
well, why aren't our pension funds investing in these things and getting the returns on them for their pensioners? Well, there is going to be more effort to try to get that kind of thing happening with British-based pension funds, especially the public sector funds. That's one of the ways that they envisage raising money. And one particular area where they want to look at involving private finance, coming back to our earlier discussion about HS2, is in resolving the conundrum of Euston Station at the south end of the route, and whether they can come up with some kind of structure that involves the private sector in financing a large part of the development around Euston Station.
Well, that was the Tory plan. They said that this could be done by the private sector, and nothing has happened in the intervening 18 months because no scheme that has ever been put forward would pay for the huge station. I mean, it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's right. And this administration claim that they're going to resolve that. You know, they believe that they've got a better sense of how they can involve private sector money, but they've also got some, pretty wacky ideas about private sector money coming in. And you spoke earlier, Christian, about the Lower Thames crossing, which is a motorway. It sounds like a footbridge, but it's actually a huge motorway underneath the Thames estuary, inherited from the previous government, estimated to cost upwards of £9 billion. Plus, there are all sorts of other associated road schemes that come off the back of it. And this government, slightly embarrassed, I think, about the prospect of spending that amount of public money in the southeast of England, have said that they're working on a private finance solution for this. But then, bizarrely, just before the 10-year strategy was published, they announced that they're already putting another £590 million. Yes, I say that number again, £590 million of public money into this motorway to kind of ease the way for the private finance that they believe they're going to get. And of course, that if you were to spend £590 million in improvements to the existing highway or rail or light rail networks, you could get an awful lot out of that. Whereas this is money that they're just putting into one single road. So there are these kind of bizarre decisions that are being made. A lot of it, coming back to your point, I think about the driverless vehicles as well, linked to this quest for growth. And that with certain things, if you kind of just chuck money at them, you'll get in some way economic growth and grow the overall size of the cake.
Yes, Mark. I think there is this obsession of trying to kind of fit any policy into economic growth without really much regard for any kind of other aspects like equality, sustainability, effectiveness, or so on. It's all kind of about numbers in the GDP, and I find this utterly depressing. I must say I'm a little bit less sanguine than you are about this. I just think that we've still got a transport policy that basically says we must have more of everything. We must have more roads and more trains and more trams and more buses and whatever, without any notion that there is a trade-off between all these different aspects, and that it should fit, as you implied, into a strategy at the beginning. The cart has definitely been put before the horse.
Let me just pick out one really interesting point, though, from this document for our listeners. What a lot of people were hoping to see from the spending review and then from the 10-year infrastructure strategy was a list of projects, a list of things that the money was going to be spent on within some of those big budgetary numbers that would actually improve road quality, road repairs, bridge repairs, improvements to rail and bus networks in their localities. And we've generally been told that we've got to wait a bit longer. So there'll be another statement from the Secretary of State for Transport, which will give us more detail on the specific requests that have been made. But loyal listeners will know that 2 years ago on the Calling All Stations podcast, we blew the whistle on a Conservative government plan at the time to at least consider turning off the passenger Wi-Fi on the Great Britain railway network under its control. And the story that Christian broke caused a great storm in the media and with the public, and which caused that policy to be reversed. Buried in the 10-year infrastructure strategy, under the digital section, not the transport section, is this statement. So, to support passenger connectivity on the rail network and deliver the government's ambition to ensure that all infrastructure has adequate digital infrastructure. £41 million is being provided to introduce low Earth orbit satellite connectivity on all mainline trains, significantly improving both the availability and internet data connection speeds for Wi-Fi connected passengers.
Well, that's great news, and one up for calling all stations. There's only one issue. You know who provides these low Earth satellite internet connections, don't you?
I'm sure you're going to enlighten us, Christian.
It's a man called Musk. And I must say, I confess that in the house that I part own in Italy, we've just been connected to the internet. And since the house is in the middle of nowhere and had very bad internet connections, it's Starlink that we're using. So, you can't get away from Elon Musk, even when you try to.
No, I believe there are other low Earth orbit providers getting
I think they're
themselves
creating a
organised.
network. They're creating an alternative European network, but I don't think it's up and running yet.
Yeah. So, but for the moment, there's some good news for rail passengers that we can track right back to an episode of Calling All Stations.
Well, thank you for that summary, Mark. I think that gives us a lot of information about the future strategy of the government, but the future kind of things coming out of government, but it doesn't really point to any coherent strategy or long-term thinking about transport. And as you know, I once wrote a book called Our Tram Socialist: Why Britain Has No Transport Policy. And I must say, I think that still stands.
Here's Christian's final thought from the departure lounge.
Well, Mark, in 1998, I wrote a piece for the Evening Standard suggesting that London's Oxford Street should be pedestrianised. It was a policy that I picked up on when I ran to try to be the Labour candidate for mayor in London in 2013, 14, 15. And indeed, at the first hustings that I was at as one of the shortlisted candidates, Sadiq Khan heard me talk about this and said, "That's a great idea. I'll pick it up." And he sort of did half-heartedly through the first couple of terms he served, but he was hampered by the fact that there was a Conservative administration in Westminster, which covers about half the road, and nothing much happened. But then 3 years ago, a Labour administration appeared in Westminster. And that gave courage for Sadiq to press ahead. And this week he's announced that he now plans to go ahead and that it's going to be rolled out. There is only one problem, which is that the Labour Council in Westminster is now pretty iffy about it and worried about it. But I think it's an absolute no-brainer. I think that Oxford Street is dire. It has all this mainly bus and taxi traffic down it. It doesn't really, which doesn't serve any purpose. People don't have anywhere much to walk. And I must say, controversially, as a cycling activist, I don't think there should be cycling down Oxford Street, even, especially definitely between, say, 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night. I think it should be just for pedestrians, and let's hope this happens.
Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.